The evening lights of the studio lot glowed like tired stars scattered across the pavement, their pale reflections trembling on the polished black cars lined outside the building. Inside, the rehearsal room felt nothing like Hollywood glamour. It felt heavy. The air was warm but not comforting. Scripts lay open across the long table like abandoned letters, cups of half-finished coffee stood cold beside them, and the low hum of equipment vibrated faintly through the walls. Sandra Bullock sat at the far corner of the table, her hands resting gently on the pages in front of her, her posture composed, her face calm to anyone watching. But beneath that calm lived exhaustion she no longer tried to name. Weeks of little sleep, endless expectations, and quiet personal battles had worn something thin inside her. She listened as the director spoke sharply about schedules, scenes, and pressure, his voice rising and falling like a storm she had heard too many times before. She nodded when expected, but her thoughts drifted far beyond the room, into memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. She thought about late nights when the house felt too quiet, about reading headlines that spoke about her life as if it were fiction written by strangers, about smiling for cameras while carrying fears she never shared, about being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. The room blurred slightly and she blinked, forcing herself back into focus. That was when the door opened. Keanu Reeves stepped inside without announcement, without the sharp energy the room carried. He wasn't holding a script, only a simple cup of coffee in one hand and in the other nothing at all. Yet something shifted the moment he entered. The tension didn't vanish, but it softened like a tightened rope finally given space to breathe. Conversations quieted. Even the director's voice faded. Keanu's presence was never loud. It never needed to be. He scanned the room slowly, not like someone checking a set, but like someone searching for a person. His eyes found Sandra at the corner of the table. They didn't linger in a dramatic way. They simply rested on her, steady and warm, as if he were silently asking a question no one else thought to ask. "Are you all right?" Sandra felt her chest tighten. She lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of the tears pressing behind her eyes, unwanted and uninvited. She shifted slightly in her chair, hoping the movement would distract from the sudden tremor in her breath. Keanu walked toward her without drawing attention, his steps unhurried, as if he were moving through a private space only the two of them occupied. He placed the cup gently beside her hand, careful not to startle her, and leaned just close enough for his voice to reach only her. "You looked like you needed this." It wasn't the coffee, she knew that instantly. It was the way he said it, quiet, certain, without performance, without expectation. For a moment, Sandra couldn't answer. Her throat tightened as memories rose without permission. Nights of holding herself together when no one was watching, moments of grief she had never publicly named. The constant pressure to be strong when all she wanted was to sit down and breathe. She pressed her fingers lightly against the cup, feeling its warmth seep into her skin, and forced a small nod. That was all she could manage. The director clapped his hands, calling everyone back to attention. Chairs scraped. Pages turned. Voices resumed, but something in Sandra had shifted. The heaviness didn't disappear, yet it no longer felt as crushing. Someone had seen it, and somehow that changed everything. The rehearsal moved forward, and the next scene demanded something brutal from her. It required despair. The kind that leaves no space for vanity. The kind that exposes the places actors usually protect. Sandra stood under the lights, the cameras closing in, and when the director called action, she didn't act. She opened. Her voice broke exactly where her real voice had broken so many times before. Her eyes filled not with practiced tears, but with the ache she rarely allowed herself to show. She let the scene take her, let it pull memories to the surface she usually buried under work and routine. The room fell silent as her performance deepened. Even the crew stopped moving. When the director finally whispered, "Cut," no one spoke. Sandra turned away quickly, embarrassed by how exposed she felt. She wiped her face, nodding politely as the director praised the scene, but she barely heard him. Her heart was racing, her hands unsteady. She needed space. She walked off the set, down the hallway where the noise faded and the lights grew softer. She stopped near a closed door, resting her palm against the cool wall, breathing slowly, trying to ground herself. Footsteps approached behind her. "You don't have to carry it alone." Keanu's voice was low, not intruding, not demanding. Sandra closed her eyes. She didn't turn right away. The words landed too close to something fragile. She swallowed, then finally faced him. He wasn't standing too near. He wasn't searching her face for answers. He simply stood beside her, sharing the space, his presence steady, unpressured. "How do you always know?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. He didn't answer immediately. He leaned back against the wall, mirroring her posture, looking down the empty hallway instead of at her. "I don't always know," he said softly. "I just listen." They stood there in silence, and in that silence something inside Sandra loosened. Her breathing slowed. The shaking in her hands eased. She didn't feel fixed. She didn't feel suddenly strong. But she felt allowed to exist exactly as she was, and that, she realized, was rare. The night ended late. The crew packed up. Goodbyes were exchanged. Sandra drove home through streets glowing with neon and headlights, her mind replaying the day in quiet fragments. The coffee, the look, the words. She reached her house, let herself inside, and found it still and dark. Her children were asleep. The world felt distant. She sat by the window, watching the city pulse below, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't immediately reach for distraction. She let the quiet sit with her. She let herself feel the strange warmth still lingering in her chest. Her phone buzzed. A simple message. "Hope you slept a little. Remember, even strong people need rest." She stared at the screen for a long time. No advice, no performance, no need for reply. "Just care." Sandra pressed the phone lightly to her chest and whispered into the empty room, "I am not alone." She didn't know why the words felt so heavy, or why they made her eyes burn again. But she knew something had begun, something she didn't yet understand, something gentle, something dangerous, something that would not stay small. Outside, the city kept moving. The world knew nothing of that quiet exchange. No cameras, no headlines, no audience. Only a small act of kindness. And a heart that had finally been seen. The day the cameras started watching. Morning arrived in Los Angeles the way it always did, too bright, too fast, and too unforgiving for anyone who'd spent the night wrestling with their own thoughts. Sandra Bullock woke before her alarm, not because she felt rested, but because her mind refused to be quiet. The house was still, the air cool, and the faint sound of the city outside felt like a distant ocean that never stopped moving. She lay there for a long moment staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that yesterday hadn't mattered as much as it did. It had been just coffee, just a few words, just someone standing beside her in a hallway when she needed space to breathe. That's what she told herself as she slipped out of bed and padded across the floor, careful not to wake her children, careful like she always was, careful with time, careful with energy, careful with emotions she didn't trust to behave. Yet when she reached the kitchen and made her own coffee, she realized she was already comparing it to the warmth of the cup Keanu had placed near her hand. It wasn't the taste. It wasn't the caffeine. It was the feeling of being noticed without being demanded from. That kind of attention didn't come with strings in Hollywood. It came with contracts, with leverage, with expectation. And because it was unfamiliar, it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Her phone buzzed again, agents and producers, questions and schedules, reminders disguised as requests. Messages stacked one after another like a pile of bricks placed carefully on her chest. Sandra answered what needed to be answered, then set the phone down and stared at it as if it were a living thing that could swallow her whole. She exhaled slowly and told herself she could handle one more day. She had handled years. She could handle a day. But as she dressed and looked at herself in the mirror, she saw something behind her own eyes that makeup couldn't fix, the quiet fatigue of a woman who had been strong for too long without being held. She forced a small smile anyway, because that was what the world expected of Sandra Bullock. A smile that says she's fine. A smile that makes everyone else comfortable. A smile that keeps the questions away. At the studio, the corridors were already alive with movement. Assistants rushing with clipboards, crew members calling out changes, the distant thump of equipment being rolled across the floor. The building smelled like warm lights, paper, and the sharp bite of coffee that had been reheated too many times. Sandra walked in with her usual grace, the kind of grace that came from surviving public storms and learning to never appear shaken. But today, even as she nodded to people and exchanged polite greetings, she felt eyes tracking her more closely than usual. There was a different tension in the air, like someone had quietly turned the volume up on attention. She could feel the whispers beginning, the subtle shifts in conversation when she entered a room, the way a few crew members looked from her to the hallway behind her as if waiting for a second act. Hollywood wasn't always cruel in obvious ways. Sometimes it was cruel in its curiosity, in its hunger to turn private human moments into entertainment. She didn't see Keanu right away, and she told herself she was relieved. But when she finally caught sight of him across the set, she felt something in her chest settle like a hand gently pressing down on panic. He wasn't performing friendliness. He wasn't scanning the room for approval. He was simply there, calm in the middle of chaos, leaning near a prop table with a script in his hand, as if everything around him was just weather passing through. When his eyes lifted and found hers, he didn't smile widely. He didn't wave. He just gave her a small nod, one quiet signal that said, "I'm here. You're not invisible." And somehow that was enough to make her shoulders drop a fraction, enough to loosen the tightness behind her ribs. The first scene of the day was lighter. Her character needed to laugh, needed to feel alive, needed to show a kind of joy that looked effortless. Sandra stood under the lights and tried to summon it, but joy wasn't something she could fake anymore without cost. She could pretend for the camera, yes, but the pretending scraped her raw when she was already worn down. The director called action, and Sandra's laugh came out thin at first, like a song played through a damaged speaker. She saw the director's expression shift, impatience flickering across his face, and she felt the old familiar fear rise, fear of not delivering, fear of being judged, fear of being reduced to a headline about decline or weakness. Then, as if sensing the moment before it broke her, Keanu's voice drifted in, not loud enough to interrupt, but clear enough to reach her. It was just one line from the scene spoken with steady timing, grounded and real, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it anchored her. Her next laugh came out warmer, fuller, and the joy finally looked believable because it had been pulled not from acting, but from safety. The crew relaxed. The director nodded, satisfied. Someone murmured, "She's glowing today." Sandra kept her face calm, but inside she knew the truth. She wasn't glowing. She was being steadied. During the break, she slipped outside to the steps near the far side of the studio lot where the noise thinned out. The sun was bright but soft, the kind of brightness that made shadows look gentle instead of harsh. She sat with her script in her lap, pretending to study lines she already knew. Her mind wasn't on dialogue. It was on the strange feeling of being near someone who didn't demand she perform strength. She heard footsteps and didn't look up immediately because she already knew the rhythm of them. Keanu sat beside her with a casual ease that didn't invade her space, holding two paper cups like someone who simply assumed sharing was normal. "Black coffee," he said, offering one to her with a small shrug. "I guessed you don't like it too sweet." Sandra let out a soft laugh that surprised her because it didn't hurt to laugh. "You guessed right," she replied, taking the cup. Their hands didn't touch, but even the near contact felt intimate in a way she couldn't name. They sipped in silence for a moment, the world moving around them at a distance. It wasn't awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when two people don't need to fill space with noise to prove they belong in it. Keanu stared ahead, then spoke like he was admitting something to the air rather than asking her to carry it. "Do you ever wonder how people forget we're human too?" Sandra's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. The question pierced her because it was exactly what had been sitting in her heart for years, unspoken and heavy. She didn't answer right away because honesty felt dangerous, but then she realized he wasn't asking for something to use against her. He was asking because he already understood the answer. "All the time," she said quietly. "Sometimes I feel invisible in plain sight. Everyone sees me, but no one sees me." Keanu's gaze softened, and when he finally looked at her, there was no pity there, no fascination, no celebrity hunger. Only recognition. "I see you," he said simply, like it wasn't dramatic, like it was just a fact. The words hit her harder than applause ever had. Sandra's breath caught, and she turned her face away quickly, embarrassed by the tears that threatened again. She had mastered the art of not crying in public. She had built entire careers on controlling what the world could access. Yet his words slid through the cracks in her armor like sunlight. "Why are you always so kind?" she whispered, and it was the first time she'd admitted aloud that his kindness felt unusual enough to question. Keanu didn't answer with a speech. He didn't try to look wise. He just took a slow breath as if the truth required gentleness. "Because I know what it feels like," he said softly. "When kindness is missing, I know what silence can do to a heart." Sandra watched him, and suddenly she felt the edges of a story she didn't yet know. Something behind his calm, something behind his steadiness. She wanted to ask what had hurt him, what had taught him this kind of quiet care, but she didn't, because some truths needed time to rise without being forced. Before she could speak again, the director's voice called from across the lot, sharp and impatient, pulling them back to work like a hook in the skin. Sandra wiped her eyes quickly, stood, and followed Keanu inside. The afternoon brought harder scenes, and with them the pressure rose. At one point, Sandra's hand began to shake while holding a prop, small at first, then more noticeable. She tried to hide it by adjusting her grip, but cameras caught everything, even the smallest tremor. The director frowned. "Sandra," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "focus. We don't have time for this." The words weren't violent, but they were humiliating in the way public impatience always is. Sandra felt her face heat, and shame rushed through her like a wave. It wasn't the shaking that hurt most. It was the feeling of being treated like a machine that had malfunctioned rather than a human body responding to stress. Before she could force herself to push through it, Keanu stepped forward. "Give her a moment," he said, calm but firm, his voice cutting through the room without aggression, just certainty. The set went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone does something unexpected. Keanu rarely challenged anyone, and he didn't do it theatrically now. He simply stood his ground with a steadiness that made argument feel pointless. The director opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, irritation flickering, but he waved a hand and turned away. Sandra's chest rose and fell quickly, her heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She hated needing rescue. She hated being the reason anyone had to speak up. She sank into a chair near the monitors, staring at her hands as if she could will them to stop betraying her. Keanu crouched near her, not too close, not invasive, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Breathe," he said gently. "You're not failing, you're just human." Sandra swallowed, her eyes burning. She forced herself to inhale slowly, then exhale, then inhale again. She followed the rhythm of his voice as if it were a rope being tossed to her in deep water. The shaking eased. The tightness in her chest loosened. And when she stood again, she felt steadier, not because she was suddenly strong, but because someone had reminded her she didn't have to earn the right to be human. She returned to the scene and delivered it flawlessly. The director clapped, satisfied, and the crew moved on, business as usual, yet Sandra felt something deeper than relief. She felt the quiet reality that Keanu had risked discomfort to protect her dignity. Not for credit, not for attention, just because he couldn't stand watching someone be crushed when a simple moment of patience could save them. When the day finally wrapped, the sky outside had turned the color of fading gold. Sandra walked toward the exit with her bag slung over her shoulder, exhaustion pressing down again, but now it wasn't hopeless exhaustion. It was tiredness mixed with something else, something like warmth, like the first fire lit in a cold room. Keanu walked beside her, not crowding her space, just matching her pace. At the parking lot, they paused near their cars, the distance between them filled with everything they hadn't said. "You always know when to step in," Sandra murmured, her voice low, almost afraid of the words. Keanu gave a small smile, not proud, not performative. "I don't always know," he replied. "I just pay attention. Most people don't anymore." Sandra nodded, and for a moment she wanted to tell him that his attention felt like medicine, that it was undoing a loneliness she had learned to live with. But vulnerability still frightened her, even with him. They parted ways with a quiet goodbye, and she drove home through the city lights, thinking about the way he'd stood up for her without turning it into a scene. That night her house felt quieter than usual. She checked on her children, watched them sleeping peacefully, and felt the familiar sting of responsibility and love that lived in her chest. She sat in the living room in near darkness, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. She replayed the day again and again, not because she wanted drama, but because her heart seemed unable to let it go. It scared her how much his kindness mattered. It scared her because in her experience, anything that mattered was something the world tried to ruin. Hollywood didn't allow pure things to stay pure. Hollywood turned softness into gossip, turned care into rumor, turned friendship into a headline with sharp edges. Her phone buzzed. A message from Keanu. "Tomorrow might be tough, but you're tougher. Don't forget to rest." Sandra stared at the words until her eyes blurred. Then she pressed the phone gently to her chest the way someone holds something precious without knowing why it feels precious. She whispered into the quiet room, barely audible even to herself. "Why does it feel like he understands me better than I understand myself?" Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and loud. But inside Sandra's home, something fragile and powerful was beginning to take shape. A connection built not on spotlight, not on public love stories, but on the quiet courage of showing up for someone when no one is clapping. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow wouldn't just be tough. Tomorrow would be the day the cameras started watching in a different way. The day whispers would sharpen into something dangerous. And the day Sandra would have to decide whether kindness was worth the risk in a world that liked to punish it. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath fear and fatigue, a new thought began to form like a promise she hadn't made out loud yet. If Keanu could stand beside her in silence, maybe she could learn to stop running from the parts of herself that needed someone too. When kindness becomes a target. The third day began with a storm, both outside the studio and inside Sandra's chest. Rain hammered against the wide glass panels of the building, blurring the city beyond into streaks of silver and gray. The sky hung low and heavy, and thunder rolled in the distance like a warning that something unsettled was moving closer. Sandra arrived early, hoping the quiet might calm her thoughts, but even before she reached the set, she sensed the shift. Conversations hushed when she passed. Phones were held a little tighter. Eyes lifted too quickly and looked away too slowly. Hollywood had a way of changing temperature overnight, and this morning, the warmth of yesterday had been replaced by a thin, electric chill. She sat in her chair near the monitors, pretending to review her script while her ears caught fragments of whispers drifting through the air. She didn't need to hear full sentences. The tone alone told her enough. Curiosity, speculation, the kind of interest that wasn't about the work anymore. She told herself not to imagine headlines, not to build storms in her own head, but imagination was a stubborn thing, especially when fed by fear. She kept her eyes on the pages, though the words refused to settle into meaning. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did, without entourage or announcement. The moment Sandra saw him, her chest loosened, but that relief was immediately followed by a new unease. Today, the looks followed him too. The glances slid from her to him and back again, stitching invisible lines between them. He noticed. She could tell by the way his posture subtly adjusted, by the way his eyes swept the room with a calm awareness that wasn't alarmed but wasn't blind either. When their gazes met, he gave her the same small nod as always, but this time there was something else in it, something acknowledging the tension neither of them had named yet. The morning's first scene was heavy. Sandra's character was being abandoned by someone she trusted, left standing in the quiet wreckage of what she believed was safe. As the director called action, Sandra felt the weight of it settle into her body before her mind could prepare. The set dissolved, the lights blurred. The words on the page were no longer lines to deliver, but echoes of memories she had tried to outgrow, promises broken, doors closing. The ache of realizing that sometimes love doesn't leave loudly, it just stops showing up. Her voice shook, then broke. Tears welled without asking permission. This time, she didn't try to control them. She let them come, raw and unpolished, because the pain she was touching wasn't imaginary. When the director called cut, the silence felt thick. Sandra turned away quickly, shame rising hot in her chest. She hated being seen like this. She hated that her emotions still had the power to undo her composure so easily. She moved off the set without waiting for instructions, her steps quick, her head down. The hallway outside was dimmer, quieter, and she welcomed it like someone slipping into deep water. She reached her trailer, closed the door, and leaned against it, her breath coming too fast. Her hands pressed against her face, as if she could physically hold herself together. There was a knock. Soft, patient, not demanding entry. "It's me," Keanu's voice came through the door, low and careful. Sandra didn't answer at first. She was afraid that if she spoke, whatever fragile control she still had would shatter completely. The knock came again, just as gentle. She finally opened the door, keeping her head slightly bowed, as if not meeting his eyes might protect her from the truth she saw there. He didn't step inside immediately. He waited, giving her space to choose. She moved aside, and he entered, closing the door behind him without a sound. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the words practiced and empty. Keanu didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was. He simply looked at her for a moment, not with analysis, not with concern meant to fix, but with a quiet understanding that made the lie feel unnecessary. "You don't have to say that to me," he replied gently. "Not here." Sandra's lips trembled. She turned away, walking a few steps into the room as if distance could hold her together. "If I let go," she whispered, "I don't know if I'll stop." Keanu followed her, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to feel distant. "Then don't stop," he said. "Sometimes holding back is what hurts the most." The words broke something open. Sandra sank into the chair near the small table, covering her face. The tears came fast now, no longer staged, no longer elegant. They came from places she rarely allowed herself to touch, the grief she'd folded into strength, the loneliness she disguised as independence, the fear that if she ever truly rested, everything she'd built might collapse. Her shoulders shook as she cried, not loudly but deeply, the kind of crying that carries years inside it. Keanu didn't rush her. He didn't place himself at the center of the moment. He simply sat nearby, close enough that she could feel the presence of another human being without being watched. The room filled with the sound of her breathing, uneven at first, then slowly steadier. Time stretched in a way that made minutes feel like something softer, something less mechanical. When she finally looked up, her face wet and unguarded, he handed her a napkin he'd quietly taken from the table. Their fingers brushed for a second, and she felt the simple reality of another person there, solid and warm and real. "You don't have to be unbreakable, Sandra," he said softly. No one is. She stared at him, struck by the way his voice carried no pity, only respect, only truth. How do you always know the right thing to say? She asked, her voice thin. Keanu hesitated, and in that hesitation she glimpsed something shadowed in his eyes. Because I've needed to hear those words too, he answered. The honesty in his voice silenced her. She realized then that his kindness was not something that floated above pain. It was something forged inside it. He didn't rescue people from the outside. He met them from the inside. The rest of the day unfolded more smoothly, though the atmosphere remained tense. But Sandra felt changed. Something inside her had been named, and once named, it could no longer hide so easily. Yet with that relief came fear. She was beginning to lean on him, to look for him, to feel steadier simply because he existed near her. Independence had been her armor for so long that needing someone felt like stepping into cold air without a coat. That evening the cast gathered for a small press interaction on set. It was meant to be routine. Questions about the film, about schedules, about the work. Sandra stood beside Keanu as flashes popped and notebooks opened. At first the questions stayed where they belonged. Then slowly they shifted. You two seem very close lately, a reporter said with a half-smile that carried more curiosity than kindness. Should audiences expect more than just on-screen chemistry? Sandra felt her chest tighten. The room suddenly felt too bright, too open. She glanced at Keanu, who answered smoothly, redirecting the conversation back to the film with practiced grace. But she could feel the gaze of the press like heat on her skin, scanning for reactions, for hesitation, for anything they could shape into story. She hated how quickly something gentle could be bent into something else. After it ended, she pulled Keanu aside near a quiet corner of the lot. "This is why I keep walls," she said, her voice low but strained. "This is why I don't let people close. They take everything and twist it. They don't leave anything untouched." Keanu listened without interrupting. When she finished, he met her eyes with the same calm steadiness she was beginning to rely on. "Let them talk," he said. "They always will, but they don't get to decide what's real." Her throat tightened. What if their words ruin everything? He paused, then answered with quiet certainty. "Then we keep walking anyway. Truth doesn't need an audience." The words followed her long after she went home. That night she sat again by her window, the city lights reflecting in the glass like distant stars. She wondered if kindness could survive in a world that thrived on spectacle. She wondered if she was strong enough to protect something fragile instead of hiding from it. Her phone buzzed. "Storms pass," the message read. "Light always finds a way back." Sandra closed her eyes, tears returning, not from sorrow this time, but from the strange relief of not carrying everything alone. She whispered into the quiet room, "Why does it feel like you're saving me piece by piece?" She didn't yet know how true that question was. She didn't yet know that kindness, once seen, often becomes a target. And she didn't yet know that the world had already begun to watch them not with curiosity, but with hunger. When the world starts whispering. The next morning did not ease into existence the way mornings usually did. It arrived already loud, already restless, already sharpened by something unseen. Sandra felt it before she heard it, a strange tension pressing against her chest as she drove toward the studio, as if the air itself were carrying news she was not yet ready to face. Traffic crawled, horns blared in distant frustration. The radio murmured voices she didn't register. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel without her noticing. She had slept little, her mind drifting between memories of Keanu's quiet presence and the unease that had followed her home after the press questions. Something was shifting. She didn't yet know what shape it would take, only that the calm they had found in small private moments was beginning to crack under the weight of attention. The studio gates were crowded in a way they hadn't been the day before. Cameras clustered at the entrance like birds sensing movement beneath the water. Assistants spoke urgently into phones. Security guided people with firmer gestures. Sandra felt her pulse quicken as she passed through, a familiar dread creeping in, the kind that came when she knew her name was about to be shaped into something she hadn't chosen. Inside, the corridors buzzed with a low hum of speculation. She caught pieces of sentences as she walked by, not enough to form a full story, but enough to confirm her fear. "It's already online. They're pushing it everywhere. Photos, too." She reached her chair near the monitors and sat down slowly, forcing her face into calm. Her phone vibrated almost immediately, a message from her publicist, then another. And another. She didn't open them at first. She knew better than to look when her heart already felt too exposed. But the room itself seemed to whisper what her phone had not yet spoken aloud. The attention had shifted. The way people looked at her was different now. Not admiring, not respectful, curious, measuring. As if she were no longer just part of a film, but part of a narrative being written elsewhere. Keanu arrived moments later. He walked in the same way he always did, unhurried, composed, his presence steady despite the chaos around him. But when he met Sandra's eyes, something passed between them that hadn't been there before, recognition. He knew. She saw it immediately in the way his jaw tightened slightly, in the way his gaze softened instead of brightened. He moved closer, lowering his voice as he spoke. "You hearing it too?" She nodded. "Not yet, but I can feel it." They didn't need to say more. They both understood what it meant. The machine had begun to move. The director called for quiet, but even he seemed distracted, his attention pulled by assistants bringing him updates in low, urgent tones. Sandra's phone buzzed again. She finally looked. Headlines, screenshots, speculation framed as discovery. Ordinary images of her and Keanu standing near each other on set now carried captions filled with implication. Phrases twisted into narratives. Kindness repackaged as performance. Presence recast as something secretive. Sandra felt her stomach drop. It was happening faster than she had expected, faster than she had prepared for. Hollywood did not wait for truth. It moved on suggestion. During a brief pause in shooting, the director pulled her aside. "Sandra," he said quietly, though his eyes kept darting to nearby assistants. "You know how this works. This story is already moving. Whether it's true or not won't matter to some people. I just want you to be ready." She forced a polite smile, the same one she'd worn through storms before. "I am," she said, though inside she wasn't sure. When she found Keanu again, he was standing near the edge of the set, watching rain streak down the windows like silver threads. She joined him without speaking at first. The world outside looked blurred and distant, like something happening to someone else. "They're already writing it," she said finally, her voice low. "They're turning us into something." Keanu nodded. "They always do." She turned to him, the fear she'd been holding back finally breaking through. "They'll ruin everything, Keanu. They'll take something simple and make it ugly. They always do." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw neither denial nor panic. She saw choice. "What matters isn't what they write," he said. "What matters is what's true." Her lips trembled. "I don't know if I can carry another wave of this, not this time." He didn't answer quickly. He let her words settle between them, let their weight be acknowledged. Then he said something that struck her deeper than any reassurance could have. "Then don't carry it alone." She inhaled sharply. The offer was not dramatic. It wasn't romanticized. It was simple. And because it was simple, it felt enormous. No one had said that to her before without expectation. No one had offered presence instead of solutions. The day moved forward, though Sandra barely remembered the scenes. She spoke lines, hit marks, delivered performances, but her mind remained caught in the undercurrent beneath it all. Every glance from the crew felt charged. Every phone in someone's hand felt like a weapon waiting to be aimed. She wondered if this was how kindness always paid its price, not with rejection, but with distortion. It was late afternoon when something unexpected happened. As Sandra stepped outside to take a breath near the quieter side of the lot, a young woman approached her hesitantly. She looked nervous, holding something small in her hands. "Ms. Bullock," she said softly, "I'm sorry to bother you. I don't want anything. I think you should see this." Sandra frowned gently, uncertain. The woman extended her hand. Inside it was an old photograph, worn at the edges, its surface slightly bent with age. Sandra took it carefully and looked down. The image showed a much younger Keanu sitting on a park bench beside a little boy. The boy's face was smudged with dirt, his expression uncertain. He held a broken toy car in his lap. Keanu was leaning toward him, focused, his hands working to fix the small, damaged thing. There were no cameras, no crowds, just two people and a quiet moment. "That's my brother," the woman said, her voice shaking slightly. "Years ago, we didn't have much. He was sick. He used to sit in that park while my mom worked. Keanu used to talk to him, fix his toys, bring him books. When my brother had to go to the hospital, he helped with things we couldn't manage. He never told anyone. He never let us tell anyone. I only recognized him recently. With all this news, I just thought you should know the kind of man he really is." Sandra's vision blurred. The photograph trembled slightly in her hands. She hadn't asked for proof. She hadn't needed it, but something about holding that quiet piece of his past undid her. This wasn't situational kindness. This wasn't a reaction to her pain. This was a pattern, a way of being. a choice made again and again when no one was watching. "Please," the woman added softly, "don't let them turn him into something he's not." Sandra closed her fingers around the photograph, her chest aching. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening she found Keanu alone near one of the dimmer corners of the lot, reading through notes. She hesitated, then held out the photo. He looked at it, and something softened and darkened in his expression at once. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. She told him. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he didn't smile. He didn't explain. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a truth that had never required validation. "It wasn't about telling," he said after a moment. "It was about doing. If kindness needs a spotlight, it stops being real." Sandra felt her throat close. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to tell him what his presence had done for her, how his words had reached places she'd kept sealed for years. But language failed her. All she could manage was, "Your kindness, it leaves me speechless." They stood there, the world buzzing somewhere beyond them, rumors building momentum, stories multiplying. But in that moment, none of it touched them. Yet Sandra knew this peace would not last untouched. She could feel it in the way attention had sharpened, in the way silence outside their small orbit had begun to vibrate with appetite. She went home that night bracing herself, and she was right too. By morning, the headlines had multiplied. Images reposted, narratives hardened, their quiet connection framed as strategy, his kindness reframed as performance, her vulnerability repackaged as storyline. Sandra scrolled through a few before she stopped, her hands shaking. She felt exposed in a way fame had never made her feel before. This was not about her work. This was about something human, something that was being turned into spectacle. She met Keanu later that day on set, and without a word they both understood. The world had begun whispering loudly enough to drown out gentler truths. And this time, the challenge ahead would not simply test their patience. It would test whether kindness could remain kind once it became visible. And Sandra, standing there with the noise rising around them, realized she was no longer afraid of what people would say about her. She was afraid of what they would do to him. Because somewhere between quiet hallways and shared silence, his kindness had become something she would fight to protect. The weight behind his silence. The storm of attention did not fade the way storms sometimes do. It thickened, it spread. It learned their routines and followed them into places that once felt safe. Sandra felt it the moment she stepped out of her car the next morning. There were more cameras now, not aggressive but persistent, waiting, hungry, the kind of presence that didn't shout but never left. She kept her face composed as she walked through the studio gates, returning nods, offering polite acknowledgments, moving like someone who had done this dance for years. But inside, something had changed. The attention no longer slid off her skin the way it once had. It pressed. It lingered. It tried to seep into the quiet space she and Keanu had built between them. Inside the studio, assistants moved faster. Conversations lowered when she passed. Someone had left a tablet open on a chair, and as she set her bag down, she saw her own name paired with his in bold letters, surrounded by words that suggested stories no one in that room truly knew. She looked away quickly, but the image had already lodged itself behind her eyes. It wasn't that she didn't know how tabloids worked. She did. It was that this time they weren't only writing about her. They were writing about someone whose entire way of being seemed to exist outside that world's hunger. And watching that world circle him felt like watching a storm gather over something fragile. Keanu arrived later than usual. When he walked in, he moved with the same quiet steadiness, but Sandra noticed the difference immediately. It was in the way his eyes traveled through the room before settling, in the way his shoulders held a subtle tension she hadn't seen before. He didn't greet many people. He came directly toward her, stopping close enough that his voice could remain private. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, then hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure what okay looks like today." His lips curved into a faint, understanding smile. "That's fair." They didn't say more because there was always someone nearby, always a schedule pressing forward, always a sense that too many ears were waiting. But Sandra felt something unspoken between them, something heavier than before. Kindness had drawn attention, and attention was beginning to apply pressure. The day's shooting took them to a different location, a quieter countryside setting meant to double for a small town. The change of scenery felt like relief at first. Fewer people, softer air, distant hills instead of towering buildings. The crew set up near old stone paths and open fields, the light gentler here, the world seeming less constructed. Sandra breathed easier without realizing she had been holding her breath for days. In the early evening, after a long stretch of filming, she and Keanu walked along a narrow dirt path lined with lanterns set up for the scene. The crew worked farther back, adjusting equipment, giving them a moment that felt almost private. The sky was pale, stretched wide, the kind of sky that made you feel smaller in a way that didn't hurt. Sandra listened to their footsteps, to the faint hum of insects, to the wind moving through distant grass. It felt like a different life could exist here, one untouched by speculation. She slowed, then stopped. Keanu turned toward her, waiting. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could soften it. "Why do you care so much?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the darkening horizon, as if searching for words that didn't want to be shaped easily. "Because I know what it's like," he said at last, "to walk through fire alone, and I wouldn't let you do that if I could help it." The words landed gently but carried weight. Sandra felt something shift in her chest, something that frightened and steadied her at the same time. She wanted to ask him what fires he had walked through, what nights had taught him to speak like this, but before she could, a small sound interrupted them. A child's cry. They both turned, moving toward the sound without hesitation. Near a line of trees, they found a little girl sitting on the ground, her face wet with tears, her knee scraped and bleeding slightly. She looked no older than 7, her body small, her distress large. Keanu knelt instantly, his movements slow and careful so as not to startle her. He spoke softly, his voice gentle and steady, telling her she was okay, that he was there, that it was going to be all right. He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at her knee, his focus absolute, as if nothing else in the world existed. Sandra stood a few steps back, watching. The girl's sobs quieted, her breathing slowed. She let him clean the wound, let him talk to her about the trees, about how brave she was, about how falling didn't mean failing. When the girl's parents rushed over, apologizing, thanking him, Sandra saw the way he waved their gratitude away, the way he made the moment about the child instead of himself. When they left, the little girl smiling shyly, Sandra found her voice again. "You didn't even think," she said. "You just went." Keanu shrugged slightly. "Why would I need to think? Kindness doesn't wait for cameras." The words struck her deeply, especially here, in a place where cameras truly were everywhere. She realized then that what frightened her was not just the rumors. It was the possibility that the world would never let him be who he was without commentary, that it would take every quiet good thing and drag it into noise. The morning after that small, beautiful moment, the noise arrived. Sandra was in her trailer when a young assistant knocked urgently and held out her phone with shaking hands. "Ms. Bullock," she said, "you should see this." On the screen was a video. Someone had filmed the scene with the little girl from a distance. Keanu kneeling, his voice unheard, the child's face blurred. The caption, however, was loud, words implying performance, suggesting the moment had been staged, framing his instinctive kindness as something calculated. Sandra felt her stomach drop. She watched the short clip once, then again, her chest tightening with each second. They had taken something pure and turned it into spectacle. They had taken a wound and tried to make it proof of a lie. Tears burned her eyes, not for herself, but for him. She left the trailer quickly, finding him sitting alone near a small village fountain, watching water ripple in quiet circles. She held out the phone. "Did you see this?" He nodded. "I did." "Doesn't it hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "They're mocking you. They're saying none of it is real." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Of course it hurts, but I can't live my life trying to convince people who don't want to believe. I know what I did. That little girl knows that's enough." Sandra stared at him, something aching behind her ribs. "How do you stay like this?" His gaze drifted, growing distant. "Because once," he said quietly, "someone was kind to me when the world wasn't, and I promised myself I'd pass that on, no matter what it cost." She wanted to ask who that someone was. She wanted to ask what it had cost. But before she could, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and she saw something cross his face she hadn't seen before. Not calm, not gentleness, pain, real and sudden. His body stiffened. He stood. "I have to go," he said, his voice low. "What happened?" she asked quickly. He hesitated, then met her eyes. "Someone from my past. They need me. I can't ignore this." Before she could say more, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the fountain, questions heavy in her chest. That night, Sandra sat alone in her hotel room, holding the old photograph the young woman had given her days before, the image of Keanu fixing a broken toy. She traced the worn edges with her fingers, her thoughts tumbling over one another. His kindness had roots, deep ones, roots planted in something she didn't yet know, something that still had the power to pull him away without explanation. For the first time since she'd met him in that quiet hallway, fear took on a new shape. She was no longer only afraid of rumors. She was afraid of losing him to a past she didn't yet understand. Afraid that behind his calm lived wounds deeper than she could reach. And as she sat by the window, the countryside night stretching wide and dark beyond the glass, she whispered into the silence, "Who were you before you learned to save everyone else?" She didn't yet know the answer, but she knew it was coming, and she knew it would change everything. When kindness finally speaks. The night felt endless after Keanu left. Sandra remained by the window long after the lights in the village dimmed and the last distant voices faded into quiet. The countryside sky stretched wide above her, dark and scattered with faint stars, but it brought her no comfort. Her thoughts circled one image again and again, the look on his face when his phone vibrated. Not sadness alone, not worry alone, something deeper, something unfinished. She had seen him steady through tension, through rumor, through the slow violence of public attention. But that moment had pierced through his calm like a crack in stone. It unsettled her more than the headlines ever could. She slept little. When morning came, it came without gentleness. Sandra woke with the ache of unrest heavy in her chest. On set, his chair was empty. The crew murmured. Some said he had returned to the city. Others said he was nearby. No one knew for sure. Sandra tried to focus on work, but her mind refused to stay where her body was. Every few minutes, she found herself looking toward the path where he usually arrived, as if willing him to appear through repetition. He didn't. Midday, her phone buzzed. A message. No explanation, no apology, just an address. "If you need me, I'm here." Sandra didn't hesitate. She gathered her things, told the nearest assistant she needed a short break, and walked quickly to her car. The drive took her away from the set and deeper into the countryside, along narrow roads that curved through quiet fields and clusters of small homes. The world felt far removed from cameras here. There were no studio gates, no flash of lenses, only wind brushing tall grass and the low murmur of distant life. She reached a small hospice on the edge of town, its white walls softened by vines, its windows open to the afternoon air. The place smelled faintly of flowers and antiseptic, of time moving more slowly. Her heart beat hard as she stepped inside. A nurse guided her gently down a quiet hallway, her voice low, respectful, as if sound itself needed permission here. Sandra stopped at a doorway. Inside, Keanu sat beside a narrow bed. An older man lay there, thin and pale, his breathing shallow. Keanu was holding his hand, both of his own wrapped around it as if warmth could be transferred through will alone. His head was bowed slightly, his shoulders no longer carrying the effortless ease she had come to know. This was not the Keanu the world saw. This was a man sitting with loss before it had fully arrived. He looked up when he sensed her presence. For a moment, neither spoke. The room held its own quiet authority. The older man stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to see her. Keanu leaned closer to him. "This is Sandra," he said softly. "She's a friend." The man's lips curved faintly. "He never left me," he whispered, his voice thin but steady. "Even when the world did, he always showed up." Sandra felt tears rise without warning. The words landed in her chest like something both tender and devastating. Suddenly, fragments aligned. The photograph, the boy in the park, the years of unseen kindness. This man was not an exception. He was part of a long, quiet story. "This is Michael," Keanu said quietly. "He was like a brother to me." Sandra stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the bed. She didn't know what to say. She didn't need to. The truth of the moment required no narration. She stood there as Michael's breathing slowed, as Keanu's grip tightened gently, as silence gathered not with fear but with something solemn and intimate. And then, without drama, without struggle, Michael's breath eased into stillness. Keanu didn't move for a long moment. He remained exactly where he was, as if leaving would undo something sacred. Sandra stayed beside him, not reaching at first, simply sharing the weight of the moment. Finally, when he rose, she followed him outside into the courtyard, where late sunlight brushed the stone walls with soft gold. They stood under the open sky, the quiet pressing close around them. Sandra spoke first, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone about him? About everything you've done for people?" Keanu looked out across the small garden, his expression composed but heavy. "Because kindness isn't a story," he said. "It's a choice. And if people know, they turn it into something else. I didn't want that. I just wanted people to feel less alone." Her eyes filled. The simplicity of his words broke her more than any dramatic confession could have. She reached for his hand then, this time without hesitation, wrapping her fingers around his. He didn't pull away. He didn't tense. He let himself be held. "You've been carrying so much for so long," she said, "but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." He turned to her, something unguarded finally rising to the surface. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Because walking beside me means facing storms, it means being misunderstood, sometimes even mocked." Sandra met his gaze without flinching. "Then let them," she said. "Let them twist things, let them talk. I know who you are, and that's enough." For the first time since she had known him, a tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't hide it. Sandra lifted her other hand and gently touched his face, grounding the moment not with words but with presence. "Your kindness saved me," she whispered. "But now let me stand beside you." Keanu closed his eyes briefly, his forehead resting against hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely sound, "for seeing me." They stood like that for a moment that felt separate from time. The countryside wind moving softly around them, the weight of years easing not because it had disappeared, but because it was finally shared. The days that followed were not suddenly easy. The rumors did not vanish. The headlines did not soften. Cameras still waited, stories still spun, but something fundamental had changed. Sandra no longer read them with fear. She no longer felt compelled to defend or explain. And Keanu no longer walked alone into quiet acts of care. When they returned to the studio, they faced the world without announcement, without spectacle. They worked. They spoke kindly. They refused to feed what wanted to grow from noise, and when whispers rose, they met them not with arguments but with consistency, with the same gentleness, the same steadiness. Months later, at a charity gathering far from the film set, Sandra stood on a stage under warm lights. The room was filled with people who had come to listen, not to speculate. She spoke not about movies, not about fame, but about unseen kindness, about how the smallest acts done without audience could change the shape of a life. Her voice was clear, grounded, strong in a way that did not deny softness. As she spoke, her eyes found Keanu standing quietly near the back of the hall. He wasn't seeking attention. He never did. He simply listened, his head slightly bowed, his presence steady. Sandra smiled then, not the practiced smile of Hollywood, but the kind that rises when something true is finally allowed to exist. When the applause came, it filled the room. But Sandra knew who it truly belonged to. Not to a performance, not to a headline, to every quiet choice he had ever made when no one was watching. Later, when the lights dimmed and the crowd thinned, they walked out together into the night. No cameras followed, no voices called. The world was simply the world again. Sandra laced her fingers through his and leaned slightly closer as they moved forward. "Your kindness left me speechless," she said softly, "but it also gave me back my voice." Keanu looked at her, his expression calm, his eyes warm. And for the first time since that evening in the hallway when he placed a cup of coffee near her hand, there was nothing unspoken left between them. Only two people, walking forward, carrying the quiet power of kindness not as something fragile, but as something unbreakable.